Are you good? All right. You vertical or horizontal? What do you think? Okay. All right, we're live. Great. Okay, so first of all, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I know it's a work night, so thanks for coming out to the meetup. Our goal is to share information, obviously to spread adoption. We tend to favor open source tools and try to make it possible to use them in wider and wider adoptions. This is kind of how we're going to roll tonight. You've already signed in. You will get a chance to grab some swag. We have some webcam shutters. You can choose to shut your webcam off physically if you don't want to worry about whether somebody's turning it on or you're accidentally turning it on yourself, which we'll hand out in a little bit. Before we get started, I just want to have a brief job exchange, which is just to give everybody a chance. I'll come back to talk about who I'm in a sec. Just to give everybody a chance, if there's anybody who is looking for a particular position they're trying to fill, or who is like to be in the market. Obviously, we're recording this, so if you're in the market and you're not officially in the market, maybe you want to casually interact afterwards. But let's start with people who are actually looking to fill a position. Is there anybody who actually wants to recruit?
Does it have to be software?
Sorry?
Does it have to be software positions?
Ideally, it would be something to do with software and testing and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Sir?
Yeah, so my name is Jeremy Hernandez. I work for MindSource. We're a consulting company in the Bay Area here and specialize in QA, software engineering.
Okay.
So part of it we want to obviously learn, about JMeter and kind of the technology side, but the other part, if anyone's looking for opportunities, we're bringing about 50 different job orders on a monthly basis. Okay,
so MindSource, your QA staffing, basically?
Yeah.
Right.
So we do staffing, we also do projects, outsourced projects, full-time as well. But about 85% of what we do is going to be on contracts.
And I assume people can find you in the mixer after we're done?
I'll be here.
Right, awesome. Anybody else got something?
Yeah,
sure. Okay.
I'm KRS Murthy. I'm founder and chief technology and chief scientist of a battery company. We're looking for people who can build the battery management system, which will be a lot of software managing lithium-ion batteries for industrial applications, residential applications, anything in 25 kilowatts hour to 500 kilowatts.
Got it. So battery management.
And my email address is very simple: bigdataexpert@gmail.com.
Bigdataexpert@gmail.com. All right, we locked that one up. Awesome. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, my name is Dakshma. I'm a QA engineer. I work for Brocade. We use manual stuff, manual testing, and I used JMeter a couple of months back, and I want to explore more into performance testing.
Okay.
If any opportunities, it would be great. Appreciate
Cool.
that.
So, right now we're kind of talking about job lists. Do you have any job openings you want to talk about, or?
No, I'm looking for a job.
You're looking for people. You're looking for a job. Got it. Right. Got it. Very good.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Anyone else? Cool. All right. So, just a little bit about who I am. I've been in the performance testing and/or synthetic monitoring business for quite a while. I started out my career at Keynote Systems, which outside-in testing, 24/7 monitoring, mobile testing, etc. My focus was on load testing and synthetic monitoring. If you don't know about synthetic monitoring, it's basically having a machine in a rack somewhere that launches a browser, goes to a website, does a transaction, reports it all. You get charts and graphs and alerts and that sort of thing. Synthetic monitoring was kind of the way to figure out whether you were online and doing a good job. It's pretty much, it still exists, but real user monitoring is considered superior for a coverage perspective. Obviously, if you know how you're treating every one of your actual users, then you know how you're doing. Synthetic monitoring is a proactive thing that kind of lets you kind of ping and make sure things are alive. But the world has kind of moved more towards real user monitoring. Keynote Systems was acquired by a company called Thoma Bravo, which merged it with Dynatrace. So I worked for Dynatrace for a bit. Dynatrace was actually a partner of mine when I was at Keynote, so I know a thing or two about the APM solutions they have. And after I left there, I went to SOSTA. SOSTA was recently acquired by Akamai, and SOSTA originally started as a company to prove that cloud-based load testing was possible, and that real-time analytics were possible, so that you could get data not 2 weeks, you wouldn't study data for 2 weeks after you ran a test, you'd watch it live and make decisions while the test was happening. They kind of cleared the way for a lot of people to build cloud scale in real time. And SOSA was acquired by Akamai primarily for their analytics, which is real-time understanding of every one of your customers from every network connection everywhere in the world, that kind of thing. So finally, I moved over to BlazeMeter, which was eventually acquired by CA Technologies. So at BlazeMeter, we focus on performance testing that's primarily shifted left or done earlier in the development process. We also do the sort of big outside-in load testing. But what's happened through my career is that at Keynote, our load testing was primarily consultant-driven. It was literally, you had a deadline, you were worried about your deadline, and you would come to us and we would run outside-in tests to make sure that your big app would scale for Black Friday or whatever, right? Super Bowl. Many of those companies had a center of excellence who was doing performance testing, but they couldn't really scale it right or understand the outside-in perspective so much, and so they would come to us. What's really weird is that the thing has shifted really from outside in through the COE all the way to the left. So the reason I moved to BlazeMeter was that people want to do testing earlier, right? They want to actually do the testing as they build the code and not you wait till it's all supposedly done before they figure out that they've got a problem. And that was something that BlazeMeter saw a long time ago. And I left SOSTA to go to BlazeMeter because they understood that developers should be able to run their own load tests, not necessarily have to always rely on a centralized function. Which doesn't mean that the center of excellence goes away, but it does mean that people can run their own tests sooner, right? So that's just a little bit about my background and kind of give you a little idea where I'm coming from. The topic tonight is live streaming. The thing we're going to focus on in particular is HTTP live streaming, which is pretty much the de facto standard now. It's the only thing that's supported on an Apple device, Apple being what it is, and in this case, good that they didn't restrict it to Apple devices. Pretty much everybody has an HLS streaming solution to get videos, not just live streams that are truly live, like if you're watching Times Square and watching cars come and go, but also just to stream a video that's on demand. You want to watch a TV show or you want to watch a tutorial or something, right? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about HLS so we're all on the same page about how HLS works. It's actually simpler than it might seem. And then we'll go into the specifics of JMeter and how you can do different kinds of testing with HLS, right? So HLS stands for HTTP live streaming. And the first part's really important, which is that it only needs HTTP and HTTPS. I don't know, does anybody here, show of hands, remember Real Media, Real Player, right? All right, so I was involved in the web back when we would use Real Media for audio and for video. Video was very fancy. And you needed a proprietary player, and it was and then, oh, I'm sorry, you're behind a firewall and your company doesn't let that stuff through. My bad, you can't watch my video, right? The beautiful thing about HTTP live streaming is it just sends regular HTTP requests and responses, small files. You basically fetch a small file, a file comes across. It all looks just like you're browsing the web, right? So from an infrastructure perspective, it just uses HTTP and HTTPS. And so that makes it proxy and firewall friendly. It can be served from any HTTP server, Apache server, whatever your server is, Nginx, whatever, and friendly with a content delivery network. So sure, content delivery networks had video-specific solutions, which were probably kind of expensive, that you could use to deliver video, but once you had this, you just needed the ability to serve lots of small files, which they're perfectly good at. So the other thing that's key about HLS is this adaptive bit rate. Show of hands again, those people who remember Real Media, who remembers waiting, buffering, you know, or the video, wait for a while the video starts, and then once it starts, you get through it, and then it stops, and it stalls, right? And clearly that was not a good way for video to become ubiquitous and everybody to love videos if you had to stare. No one's used to watching a video where it stops. It's not supposed to stop, right? So the cool thing about HLS is that there's something called Dash, we'll talk about that in a sec, but HLS made very readily available this notion of adaptive bitrate streaming where, and you'll notice this, sometimes you'll go to a website and a video will start playing and it seems a little chunky, a little pixelated maybe, and then after a moment it gets clearer. Or it goes from being clear and then it gets chunky. And what's happening is that literally the client that's playing the video is detecting the bandwidth and requesting the appropriate stream for that bandwidth, and if the bandwidth is light, then it's going to request a very compressed stream that's lower resolution. It's going to look pixelated on your screen, right? And if the bandwidth is good, it's going to request the fatter stuff, right? So what that means is that every video has multiple stream variants. So variance is a term you want to kind of park in your brain really quick. So imagine you're watching a video. The video we're going to show in a minute is a sort of about us video on a demo website. That's just one video. But that video has, I believe in this case, 5 variants. Each one has a different resolution and bandwidth requirement, right? And what's cool is that the client chooses and re-chooses the best stream dynamically as time rolls on, so that, let's say you're on a mobile connection and it's weak, instead of not being able to watch the video, you can still watch it. You're just being sent less data. So the components are pretty straightforward. There's an encoding and encapsulation component, which is really, might be called a transcoder. Amazon has something called the elastic transcoder. This thing is really, in the case of static assets, like a tutorial video we're going to see, this is a one-time job. You just put your video in and it spits out the files you need and you're sort of done, and you're not going to use this dynamically, right? In the case of an actual live feed, this thing has to be in the loop the whole time. Then, it does the heavy lifting. It's CPU intensive. It's basically rendering the video at the right resolution and creating a master index of all the variants, an index of what's in each of the variants, and a bunch of what they call .ts files. So those TS files are the video actually. So the little TS files are the content that's going to get streamed. And we'll see how this works out when we're testing, right? So if you work back up from the bottom, the video is chopped up into equally sized little segments for each of the resolutions. That list of segments is contained in a variant index, which is like, oh, I'm watching it at 1.5 megabits per second or whatever. And then that index itself is put into a master index which says, here's the different streams you can get at these different resolutions, right? So the encoding encapsulation creates that stuff, but then we get into the part we're really going to talk about tonight, which is then you just put those goodies on any web server or any content delivery network, and they can get through a proxy. And the client, which could be a mobile device or just a JavaScript app in a browser, will fetch those as needed. It'll communicate with the backend, get the right resolution, and download. So we're going to focus on what's in the red box, because what we're testing is the ability for a client to fetch that stuff and for the server that's serving it to scale adequately to deliver all those streams, right?
So
it's funny, we think of stream, I think that's like a, in the old world, that would literally be opening kind of a persistent connection that something is flowing through. In this case, you're literally just downloading these files like they were pictures on a wall. And the client is stringing them together to make them into a never-ending video. So here's the playback flow at a really high level, right? First, you go get the master playlist. In this case, we're going to do this about demo video, which is just a video that talks about this demo site. I'll show you in a sec. So when you click play in the player, it says, ooh, I better go get the master playlist. And in this case, it's, blah, 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 blah. It's coming from S3 on Amazon, and the file name is index.m3u8. These M3u8 started as a playlist for MP3s, and M3u was just a playlist for MP3s. The 8 on the end means that it's in Unicode, it's new code, so I don't have to worry about characters. Basically, this is the standard format. Then the client parses that master playlist for a list of variants and chooses one. So that and we'll see an example in a sec. That master playlist has a list of other playlists within it. And then the client chooses which variant playlist to go get, depending on its bandwidth or resolution. In this case, that's the about demo in the 2 meg format, right? And within that file is a list of the fragments, the little TS files that you need to play, right? And so an example would be to go get about demo HLS 2 meg 00000.ts. So the very, very first one in the whole series of segments is in this case is all zeros, right? So if you're doing a live stream, what happens is this is a loop, because you don't know what you're going to be playing 5 minutes from now. It hasn't been captured yet, right? And so what happens is that the client fetches the live stream, it does these indexes, it gets the right resolution, it fetches the segment, and then it basically runs out of segments really quick and has to go back and ask for a new file. So it gets another index, kind of traverses this again, and starts grabbing 01 and 02 and 03, right? When it's live, whereas when it's static, what happens is that this playlist here would probably contain literally the segments for the entire video, which is the case for the demo we're going to show. It has like 111 segments. So this is what a master playlist looks like. It's a lot of text, which is actually good and bad. It makes it very easy to parse. There's a little bit of a header or whatever, and then there's the different resolutions. You see the 2 meg, the 1.5, the 1, and the 600K. And it tells what codec it's been coded with and what resolution it is and what bandwidth is the trigger for using that. And then we choose one of those. In this case, we're going to choose the 2 megabyte feed. And then that file looks like this, which is now a file that says, hey, each of these segments targets a duration of 13 seconds, and here's a list of the segments. That first one's 12 seconds long, and it's called that, and the next one's 9 seconds long, blah, 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 right? So the player then basically just starts fetching these individual files, just like it's requesting an image on a page, right? And starts working its way through that list. The fragments are where the video really lives, right? So in this case, we've got a video that's gonna stream, and this segment 000 kind of has the title slide and the agenda in my little video I'm going to show you in a second, right? So let's pop over and do a live demo. Okay, so here we are. If I click on About Us, and I rewind because I played this earlier, my apologies. Right, so this is a video that's going to stream to us using HLS, right? It's just a JavaScript client that when I press play, it's going to start fetching segments and playing in there. In fact, to make it more visible, I could put on the developer tools for you here. And then let's hit play. And what you'll see is it's already fetched some while I got to that page and everything, it fetched some. But as that's playing, it's going to start fetching more of these TS files, right? And that's what's happening down in the bottom there. It's as it plays through the video, it's just fetching ahead the next segment of the video. So rather, also, what's different from the old world is you're not downloading a giant video file, a giant MP, before one of these huge multi-megabyte files in order to watch a video and waiting for it to all be downloaded. You're just downloading these little segments as you go and you can watch it, right? And there's enhancements that deal with things like fast forwarding or rewinding, but you can see what's happening. It's fetching these files, and they're all in order 8, 9, 10, right? So that shows you what's going on there. Let's jump back to the slides real quick here. So hopefully now you have an idea. HLS is not actually complete rocket science. It's really just an idea that you encode a stream into a bunch. First it gets actually coded into a big, huge file that gets chopped into these segment files, these TSs, right? And then the TS files are laid down in a file directory somewhere, and they're just served up like images or anything else. It's not, at that point, it's not proprietary, it's not weird, it's not hard. You do need a client on the other end, whether it's a mobile app or a JavaScript running in a browser that understands how to get the indexes, parse them, request the files as it plays, right? Now, in order to script this in JMeter, we have what I call the old style and the new style, and we'll talk about each of those for a second, right? So this is a screenshot I captured out of JMeter, and what's happening here is that we have a thread group that has this thing called a once-only controller. And for those that don't know, when you're passing through many iterations, the once-only controller only gets run once, right? So the first thing that happens is you get the master playlist, and that's a list of those variants, the different bandwidths, etc., right? And you extract that chunk list using a regex extractor, and then you do a loop where you go through. This one's actually trying to go through all of them, so it does a loop where for each of those playlists, it's going to get the playlist for the variant, that second file, which contains chunks, and the extra, and then extract the segments, the streams, and then get the segment, and then loop back around again, right? Now that's what we call the old way of doing it, and I'll show you what that looks like in JMeter really quick here. So I'm going to grab the right one for you. Right. Okay, so here we are. We've got a once-only controller. It basically goes and fetches, and we're using variables here, so it's a little harder to read, but we're going to fetch the playlist along the path that it lives on from the server that it's hosted on. And then we have a regular expression extractor that's looking for files within that list that end in M3U8, right? And it's building up an array of those chunks, they call them. It's another term for these sort of the next thing down in the tree, and storing in something called chunk list. And then this loop controller, it has a for each that takes that chunk list and takes the individual entries in the chunk list in the array and spits them out as a chunk, a variable called chunk, and then we go get the chunk.m3u8 file. So this is where we're getting now that variant file that contains the list of streams, right? And there's a regex extraction that puts those in a variable called streams. And then we have a for each controller that actually cruises through the list of those streams and fetches them, right? So this is a lot of code, like it's really code, but this is a lot of stuff here. In the old school way, it works pretty well, but you'd have to kind of A, understand what's happening, and B, create this whole thing and make sure you do it right and don't break anything. So what we at JMeter decided to do was, part of what we're up to, I mentioned earlier, is that we're into sort of democratizing testing and spreading it to the left, which means that it's great to have specialists, but specialists are always under time constraints, and there's not very many of them. And so how can you get more testing done? Well, you get more testing done by having more people be able to do testing. So it happens at the development phase, not after it gets to some separate phase, right? So here's the old school way of doing HLS. Here is the way of doing it using the plugin that we recently released, right? So here we have a thread group that calls a sampler, and we're done. So it's a little shorter. And to be honest, it is, we'll take a look. I want you to understand that this is basically, I believe we're on version 1.2 or 1.3 of this. This is an evolving thing. It does the things you would want to do very, very well, very easily. But just like anything that sort of encapsulates the functionality, you have a little less control over all the little bits and pieces. But it obviously makes jumping in and getting something done here much, much easier. So if I go over to, it's loaded already. Let's just, all right. So actually I want to use, I'm just going to go load a new one here in a second. Right. Okay, so here we have, we're actually going for that same video, and all I do is I put in the URL of that first master index, right? That M3U8 file that contains the list of streams with the list of segments, right? And then I can do things like decide how long I want it to play, and I can play with the bandwidth. I can force it to use a particular bandwidth, when I run this, it's basically going to do all the heavy lifting for me, and it's going to, it went in there and it figured out I wanted the lowest resolution file. It figured out that was the 600K file. So if we look here, if I look at the response data, that's that first master file that it fetched, right? And then it fetched the variant index file that has a list of the segments in it. And then it just started working its way through the segments, right? And by requesting each of the segments in turn, right? And I'm not seeing the details on that because that's binary data, so I can show it here, right? But, so, is that clear? What's happening is that this thing, all we're doing in the case of using the HLS sampler is we're giving it the starting place, that master index, and we're telling it whether we want, the biggest file, the smallest file, the minimum bandwidth, maximum bandwidth. We could put in the exact bandwidth for a particular one of the variants if we knew it here. That assumes you're already going to look at that file and know what's in it, but that's totally doable. And then you just go, and it runs, right? So there are some things we have kind of on our roadmap. For instance, if you were to go to a true live feed, it's actually like I did Times Square last night, right? So you go to, there's an Earth cam of Times Square. You go there, and it takes a minute to kind of get initialized, and they probably want to show you an ad. But once it's up, you're literally watching live video of Times Square with people going in and out of the ticket stand there where you can buy discount theater tickets and everything. And what that's doing is that's pacing itself so that it requests another TS file about every 5, 10 seconds, whatever it is, as it goes. At the moment, this sucker doesn't really pace itself. It just sort of starts fetching TS files. And if you've got a lot of TS files, it's going to work its way through the list, right? So pacing is actually something we'll probably add, right? Right now, this is a great way to exercise the infrastructure that's delivering those videos as it is already. It's just going to exercise it harder than a real user would. So there's a little bit of adjustment you'd make, which is to watch it on the back end and say, okay, we're getting a lot of feeds, you know. So this being an open source plugin, it's actually anyone can actually go to GitHub and see the source and contribute to a pull request if they actually want to add something new. But I did sort of add the pasting to the list of stuff to do this week. So let's get back to the video story. So, any questions on what we've just seen? I'm going to kind of shift to another topic in a second. I wanted to go ahead up here.
If you are covering later, that's okay. You can tell me. What are the variants of whatever you are doing here? Does it include video conferencing, multi-part video conferencing?
Right.
It's done. That's one. Secondly, video in a video, and then multimedia in a video. How do you?
Yeah, let me rewind a bit. So first thing you said, would something like video conferencing need scope for this?
Can it be used? When you want to take in a video conferencing, there are split screens and all of them are coming together, right?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to the question as to how they actually deliver that. Like to an end user, they might literally, I don't know whether they're using HLS or not. I use Zoom a lot. I'm using Zoom right now, actually. Don't know whether the underlying technology is that. That'd be a follow-up thing. I don't know the answer to whether, and also there are a few other standards for streaming video. This particular sampler wouldn't do other standards.
Okay.
It's just that HLS is becoming kind of a predominant one. That a lot of people have.
And all of that, you're not.
So remember, this isn't dealing with the encoding part, right? The encoding is all upstream, right? The whole nature of this technology is that it just creates a big old stash of files and indexes for the files, and then you just fetch the files, as opposed to the whole issue of, well, how do I take a live stream and encode it and distribute it, right? In the case of live, you're actually, it's very similar, except that the directory with the files in it is being populated on the fly, and the indexed files are being indexed or being refreshed on the fly, but the rest of it all to the client and to us works the same way.
And also when you assume that the media, whether you're a cable or over the air or whatever it is, you assume that its performance parameters are, you don't care.
Well, so no, so you can, so do you care what, so remember there's bandwidth is involved here, so you can model for different bandwidths. First of all, you can tell it which stream to deliver. Second of all, if you were to run this on the JMeter platform, you could actually impose bandwidth restrictions so that the streams are requested and fetched across a constrained pipe. So if you want to model someone on a mobile device, yeah, you could actually see how is this going to behave if all the devices are 3G or, God help you, 2G in the evolving world or something like that, right? Right? Question in the back? Is there a what? Yeah, so is there a delay online when there's live streaming? There is always some delay, and it differs from site to site. I've noticed that it seems pretty typical to have something on 10 seconds. But there are many of the streaming systems actually have the ability to impose a delay, sort of for security purposes, like if something bad happens, they can shut it off before it goes out to the real world, right? But there is always, none of them are like, you know, FaceTiming somebody and having it that, you know, that's pretty low latency FaceTime is, but most video streaming is done with at least some delay, which as a viewer you don't care unless you're trying to consume both the live feed and the recorded one at the same time. And if you're in the room, it would be confusing, but if you're at the other end, you wouldn't know any better, right?
But except that if there's what's called an eagle eye expert, they can detect the difference. There's a category of experts called eagle eyes.
Yeah.
They can detect it.
Yeah, I'm not talking about whether it's authentic or whatever. Yeah, just the question was just, is there a delay?
Oh, there is.
There's always going to be some. First of all, there's going to be a latency. Never going to be faster than the speed of light. But actually, the fact that it has to be captured, encoded, distributed, fetched, displayed, there's never going to be. There's never going to be like a sub 1 second delay. I can't imagine in that scenario. I don't know the technology that can do all that and get it to the client.
Does the plugin show graph?
Sorry?
Does the plugin show graph?
Does the plugin show a graph? No, the plugin itself does not show a graph. It does output data that would be read by any other JMeter graph. By its design, though, it sort of does this as one really big fetch. So another thing that I think we probably ought to put on the roadmap is maybe some way of getting incremental data. So when you run the hard way, you'll see it first fetch the playlist, and then you'll see it fetch the other playlist, and then you'll see it fetch the segments, and tick, 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 tick. When you run this, we sort of do it as a block. Sorry?
You can really just see the time, how much time it took to download one playlist.
Yeah, so could you see the time how much it took to download something? You could. All those response times are captured for sure. I think more likely the reason you would use this approach is actually to stress the infrastructure, and you're probably going to be watching it more than you're watching your graphs. So right, you'd be watching the bandwidth going through the gateway, the CPU and the bandwidth on the individual servers. You'd be watching the health. So your goal is, A, can my infrastructure handle, say, 5,000, 10,000 concurrent users? And what happens when I try? Right? Now, you're going to get results for sure on our side, but in a case of something like this, it's likely that there's people who are going to be able to watch back-end metrics that are perhaps more important to them than because we're not really a client, right? We're not running this in a browser, right? So the data we're getting is useful, and it's certainly going to tell you how much latency there was between request and response and that kind of stuff. But when you're tuning the metrics on this, you're more likely to say, okay, I'm going to hit this hard. Do I get errors? Does it all get served?
So you can basically move it, like let's say I want to download the same video 10 times.
Yes, no, you can not only download the same video 10 times, you could have 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 users all doing it at the same time, right? And so you've got all these fetches for all these assets. And remember, this HLS simplifies this so that you're just fetching files, right? Which is cool because actually, particularly the Nixes, the Unix and Linux stuff, it's pretty good at handling a lot of file I/O at the same time, right? So it works out pretty well. Question over here?
From the existing assertions that JMeter has, what can you use with this plugin, and you've developed any assertions to ensure the PS files are correct at the end of the download?
Great question. The screenshots on the GitHub page show 2 assertions attached to this plugin. I unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, didn't reach the top of my list was to ask the authors, what did you use there and what's possible? So I don't know. That's a great question for follow-up, which is that A, right now, what assertions just work? And B, what else can you do for assertions and what might be on a roadmap? They had an assertion for the master playlist and an assertion for the variant index. I don't know exactly how those had those wired in, and I haven't found it yet. So I have to find out though. We just released this in the last month, and I've probably spent 12 hours preparing for this meetup, but I didn't get to the assertions. It's a good question though, because I want to know the answer to it. It's actually in the screenshots. Right. More questions?
Does it provide a rating at the end?
A rating?
Yeah.
No, we're not getting like a health report or something like that. That would be
How well is all happening?
in terms of rating. You're going to know
The faithfulness, how well
you mean like the quality of the video.
quality of the video.
Yeah, so you're not actually assembling the video and playing it here. You're fetching
Yes,
the
yeah,
TS
you're
files.
just
So it's not the same as like if you're like rating a VoIP connection for sound quality and stuff. It's not the right solution for that. All right, so I'm going to. We still have more time for Q&A, but I'm actually going to shift on to the second little thing we sort of teased in the meetup, which was. One of the things we're asked on a lot of times is that obviously we have a solution which handles multiple open source protocols, but it actually is based primarily around JMeter. And so when someone's moving from something else to JMeter, often they'll ask, well, how do I teach my team, how do I either learn for myself or how do I teach my team JMeter more quickly? There's not a lot of books, there's not a lot of courses out there. And so we created something called the JMeter Academy. We already had a 5-day email course, which is super basic, which is just you could sign up for this 5-day email course, and every day you get like a 5 or 10 minute long video that would sort of say, hey, let's get started. Now that we did that, tomorrow I'll teach you something new, and you'd learn enough to be dangerous with JMeter, but not a lot of depth, right? So we created something called the JMeter Academy, And you don't have to know this URL. You can just Google JMeter Academy and you'll find it. If you go to the URL, you'll see this, which is a sign-up page. And the current course that's out there is really the fundamentals, Introduction to JMeter. And there will be an advanced JMeter course and a continuous testing course with JMeter. And what you get is there's if anyone knows LMS, Learning Management System, so you get a login for an LMS. You get a list of activities to do. I'll show you that right here. You get a list of activities to do, and lesson 1, introduction and agenda, lesson 2, building your first script, lesson 3, variables, properties, and functions, lesson 4, config elements, scoping and logging, lesson 5, recording scenarios, lesson 6, building smart scripts, and there's a lab guide, which is really extensive, a course quiz, and then you're done with the course, right? And as you go through it, you get, you can keep track of your progress to see how far you've gone. So this basically is like paid professional training, but it's for JMeter, it's free. So if you want to learn, or if somebody you know wants to learn, or you're trying to enable a team, this exists. Just Google JMeter Academy and you'll find it. There's a couple exercises where it helps to have a BlazeMeter account, but BlazeMeter accounts are free, so you don't actually have to be a paid customer to be able to go through anything in here. Just download JMeter and follow the instructions, and you're good.
Just a curiosity question.
Yep.
Your own LMS or you're using
no, we're leveraging somebody else's LMS. So we found a partner who actually had an LMS we could kind of bolt ourselves into. So, any questions about that? Yes.
How long does it take you to do one lesson?
How long does it take?
Yeah.
Okay, great question. So these videos typically are 20 to 30 minutes each, and there's 6 of them. So I would say realistically to get through it and do the exercise, you're talking about 6 or 7 or 8 hours of commitment probably to get through the whole thing. It's not, it's not a 1-week course. It's not going to take you 40 hours, right? They are in big chunks, though. They're not sort of in the 3 minutes and then you take a quiz, 2 minutes and you take a quiz. It's more of it's kind of like sitting through a lecture and then having a homework assignment, right? But obviously you can rewind and fast forward and change the speed, that kind of stuff. Another question over here somewhere? We're good? Okay. That is the meat of what I wanted to share tonight. Obviously, we're all here to kind of learn more about JMeter and learn more about what's going on in the testing community. So be sure to leverage each other. I've learned a few things already just by chatting to a few of you tonight that I didn't know, and I've been in this business forever. So take a little time to chat with some people before you go. We are always looking for people who actually have an interesting topic they think will be relevant to the open source testing community or to testing automation. We will be at Jenkins World. If any of you are involved in continuous integration, we'll be at Jenkins World next week in San Francisco. We'll be doing these meetups roughly once a month. We'll probably do it in this location pretty often since it's pretty central for people in the South Bay, and we're now part of CA, so it's kind of easy. You got a question in the back?
Yes. You never shared your Git repo.
Sorry?
Your Git repo.
The Git repo, yeah. The Git repo is just, if you go, I'll literally Google it. BlazeMeter, I'll do HLS sampler plugin. GitHub. I'll add BlazeMeter to that. All right. So all of the plugins that we contribute to open source are actually under this BlazeMeter/JMeter BZM plugins. And if you look under here, HLS is one of those plugins. There's a README here that goes through it. This is the screenshots I was referring to that actually show an assertion in there. And all the source, of course, is right here. And the source is divided into a GUI section and a logic section. And in the logic section, there's a grand total of 4 files that comprise the whole thing, right? And you're welcome to just jump right in here and check it out if you want. If you know Java, there's not a ton of things to parse through here and understand. And then it's tied to the if you look at the GUI stuff here, there's 3 files that explain how all the GUI works, right? So, and that is absolutely open source. You're welcome to take it and mess with it. You're welcome to open a pull request if there's something you think we ought to add to it, or if you found a bug. And I mentioned, I think we're on to our 2nd or 3rd revision on this. And we just revised it 11 days ago. This is pretty much an evolving thing. We released it in the last month or so, and we have some other plugins we've also released, making, for instance, HTTP support, HTTP2 support possible in JMeter. That was kind of a gaping hole. JMeter didn't have support for sessions that were limited to HTTP2. We've also got a WebSocket sampler and XMPP sampler, and the parallel fetching sampler. So one of the things that JMeter doesn't typically do is fetch 2 things at the exact same time. It's more sequential. So there's a sampler that actually can fix that. So this is what we've contributed. We've also contributed, which you find elsewhere, not here, the interactive debugger for JMeter. So if you actually want to be able to step by step through a JMeter test and actually understand what all is happening and where control moves and what the variables are, that's actually in the JMeter plugin manager, which is another thing we contributed. So if you go to the plugins manager, it used to be that with JMeter you install plugins by going and getting zip files, unzipping them, and putting them in a libx folder. If you just go put in the plugin for the plugin manager, then you can do all from a GUI. So here you now have the ability to browse through a list of plugins, choose which ones you want to install or uninstall, see which ones have upgrades available, see which ones you don't have installed yet that are out there, and just click a button and it'll download the files, add them to your JMeter, and reboot. And the debugger, which I just mentioned, step-by-step debugger, is pretty cool. What that does is literally just like any development environment, it lets you move a step at a time through your JMX, your JMeter script, and watch the variables, be able to look at what's happening. So if you have a complex script, it makes it much easier to write and debug them. So on that note, I want to thank you guys again for coming out.
Who are your biggest verticals who use your place?
Who are the biggest verticals who use JMeter? So the good news is for us is that anybody who believes that software is critical to their success is a customer, and the QA contractor company is smiling because they know that too. So we're all kind of in the software business now, right? So if you make widgets, you probably interact with your customer primarily through software, whether it be a website or mobile apps. So we have the usual suspects you'd think, like e-commerce and the like, but literally
Security industry.
Keurig coffee, they make they sell the coffee that you put in the machine and you go ka-chunk and it spits out. They're a customer, right? So we have quite a water. So we're really more not clustered to verticals in industry. We're clustered to companies that are betting on IT transformation and digital distribution, right? And who primarily are looking to get away from the cadence they're used to in old software cycles and get to a faster software cycle, because the traditional tools tend to be more of a long lead time, slower, large releases done 6 or 18 months apart, and people want to get to a place where they can actually ship code early and often, which is kind of the world that we live in, right? Any other questions? Yes? Okay, APIs on Amazon, okay. So great question. So Amazon's elastic and it's huge. Do I need to run performance tests, right? The answer is yes, but sort of with a caveat that you have to kind of think through what you're going to test and how you're going to test it. But our latest demo site, in fact, is built entirely on Amazon infrastructure. So if you go to this site, this will be at a different URL shortly, but if you go to the site we built, this is a mix of static web pages, API calls, and that HLS stream I showed you, right? And this is using Lambda functions in the back, so it's serverless, right? So like, well, do you need to? What's the health of the server? If the server doesn't exist, do I care what the CPU is, right? Like, so there are still constraints with how you size things and how you optimize things. We have a database call in here that was intentionally written as if it were by sort of a junior programmer that doesn't really understand the most efficient way to do it. And when you run it, the performance is significantly degraded. It's many more milliseconds. It's probably 2 seconds instead of half a second or something. I don't know what it is. But when you use the DynamoDB call that's purpose-built for fetching data, it comes back like that, right? So there's an example where even though it's an elastic thing, you still need to actually test the app like the user would really use it and baseline your performance, and then if anybody ever touches the code again, you run the test again, which means weekly or however often you're touching the code, right? You run the test again, and you make sure you haven't violated one of your baselines, right? So you still do need to test it. The funny thing, obviously, about Lambda is it kind of gets back to the old mainframe world on a different scale, which is that you pay for every call, right? You pay very little for every call, right? But in the mainframe world, testing is hard because if you hit a mainframe with testing, you get a bill for the number of times you hit it, right? So do you really want to hit it hard, right? Thank God Amazon's so cheap that it's not really material. You can run your tests, you can do your 10,000 users or whatever you think you're going to need. But yeah, it makes sense to actually, we're just releasing this demo site at Jenkins World, and we'll have demo scripts that beat up this demo site. And in the case of the Lambda functions and all, there are sizing. You do have the ability to size it on the back end for what it should be able to consume. You sort of have, there's sort of knobs and levers you can turn, and you don't want to turn those too high and waste money, but you also don't want to have them set somewhere where if you get a spike of activity, people are going to get 500 errors instead of content, right? So the short answer is yes, you still need to test, even though it's not your server. We make integrating, if you care, we make integrating CloudWatch data back into your reports straightforward. So if you figure out what the metrics that matter are on the CloudWatch side, you can actually have them overlaid on your BlazeMeter graphs. But if you've already know how to watch in the back end, that's an option. You don't have to do that, but it can be useful if you need a report that shows, wow, when we do this, this criteria goes to the roof, and then response times get bad, or we get 500 errors or whatever. More questions? Show of hands, who has been in this building before tonight? One. Yeah, in the CA building. Just a couple of you. So I guess they opened this first floor facility, I don't know, has it been 6 months? Recently-ish. And we're fortunate that we can just kind of do these public events. They do a number of public events. This is where the CA employees get to have free lunch every day. They saunter down the elevator, and in the kitchen there, they get a free lunch. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find it sort of comfortable and, reasonable place to hang out. Not encourage you to drink and drive, but if you haven't had a beer yet, and like a beer before we go, I have to haul out everything you don't drink. Thank you for coming. And remember, it's a good time to kind of have a little networking when we're done. And appreciate you all coming and joining us tonight. Thanks.